hotel proprietors say that they will not serve people with age-consent, but 99% of them actually did. So, I mean, there are a couple of things that are noteworthy about this study. One is that the predominant attitudes were obviously quite negative, but the actual behaviors in the moment did not match the attitudes. In fact, they were basically the opposite. People said one thing in terms of what their attitude was, but they did another when these possible customers were standing in front of them. So Lapierre concluded that attitudes, I mean, they're important to know what the attitudes are, but they don't predict actual behavior in a moment, and therefore not important in our attempt to understand why people do what they do. And this study, while it's particularly dramatic, this dissociation between what people said, this, this blatantly racist attitude statement, but then a sort of more accepting behavior, it's not a fluke. Many studies, most of them in the laboratory, rather than sort of this naturalistic project that Lapierre did, many studies came to similar conclusions that attitudes may not predict behavior very well. In 1969, Alan Wicker reviewed a number of laboratory studies that used some attitude measure to predict some behavior in the lab, and he found that across 42 different laboratory studies, the average correlation between the attitude measure and the behavioral measure in each study was 0.15. Now, correlations can go from +1, meaning the two constructs are perfectly covariant with each other, to -1, which means they perfectly inversely relate to each other. A correlation of 0 means that the two constructs don't covary with each other at all. There's no relationship between changes and fluctuations in one and fluctuations in the others. A correlation of 0.15 between attitudes and behavior is pretty darn close to 0. Yes, it's positive, so in general, people's behaviors are slightly related to their attitudes, but it's not a strong correlation at all between two things that seem like they should be strongly related. So Wicker really concluded that attitudes are at best only weakly related to behavior. More often than not, attitudes are unrelated to behavior, and so they're really not worth studying as predictors of behavior because they're what we say, but they're not what we do. And so for a long time, the study of attitudes was very unpopular in social psychology because of this worry that they didn't actually predict behavior. And this lasted really until the 1970s, when two social psychologists named Fishbein and Agin came up with a couple of conceptual and methodological advances that put attitude research back on the map. Because they were able to come up with an answer to the question of why is it that attitudes don't seem to predict behaviors very well, and they were able to offer a framework for understanding how attitudes can predict behavior. So Fishbein and Agin really brought back the study of attitudes to social psychology. What they did was, they came up with a methodological explanation, the principle of aggregation, which I'll talk about in a moment, to understand why the correlations between attitudes and behaviors were so low. And then they came up with not one, but two, because they were very flexible and they changed it, two conceptual frameworks for understanding how attitudes could predict behavior. That set the stage for a lot of work, continuing today, that does link attitudes and actual behaviors. The first thing that Fishbein and Agin argued is that Lapierre, and everybody who came after Lapierre, did not do very good studies in terms of their methodology because they tried to relate one particular attitude measure to one particular behavior. In Lapierre's case, are you going to serve these people? And did they serve them? In most other studies, they would give a questionnaire to measure altruism, for example, and then they would give people in the lab an opportunity to be altruistic, and they saw that the attitude about altruism predicted the one altruistic behavior. What Fishbein and Agin argues that a single measure of anything is a bad measure. Because when you have a single measure of something, there's too much potential error in such a measure. Instead, you need multiple measures to get reliable results. And Fishbein and Agin specified two types of multiple measures that they believed were needed to accurately study attitude-behavior links. Now, on the attitude side, usually attitudes are measured with questionnaires. And you're going to have the experience after break of designing your own attitude self-report questionnaire. And that is what it is. That's usually the way that attitudes are studied. What Fishbein and Ashton were more worried about was the measure of behavior. In the Lapierre study, there was one behavior. Did they serve the people or not? But Fishbein and Ashton argued that to actually measure behavior that could be predictable by attitudes, you need two kinds of repeated measures. One kind is you need repeated observation measures. So rather than just trying to predict, did this manager serve this Asian couple one time, you want to look over a period of time to see what the history, the trajectory of their behavior was. Let's say we're interested in whether people who have positive environmental attitudes are more likely to engage in recycling behavior. That would be a reasonable attitude behavior link to look for. People who really think that saving the environment is important, are they more likely to engage in this concrete behavior of recycling? Well, you might say, did the person put out recycling last week? Like my recycling day was today. Did I put it out last night? Yes, I did. But if you look at just one moment that a person could put out recycling, there's a lot of error in that. There's a lot of possible noise. Like maybe I was away this week. Maybe I was somewhere warm, not just in my mind, but actually physically, so I wasn't home to put out the recycling. Maybe I didn't have any recycling to put out this week. Lots of things could have happened this week that made me not put out any recycling. So Fishbein and Ashton argue you need repeated observations. Don't just look at what I did this week, but look at what I did the week before, and the week before. Look at what I did all year. Use a broad time window to look at behavior, and you'll minimize the error that would be associated with any single time measurement. Similarly, you don't just need multiple observations, you need multiple behavioral criteria, or what they would call multiple act measures. So if you're interested in my recycling behavior, you shouldn't just find out whether I put a recycling bin on the curb last night to be collected with the town garbage and recycling pickup. You should find out whether I recycle beverage containers when I'm at work. Do I put those in recycling bins? Do I recycle batteries? And you can come up with all different possible recycling behaviors that I might engage in, rather than just this one single one. And again, the more behaviors you look at, the less noise you have, and the more possibility, Fishbein and Ashton argue, more possibility you have of having attitudes predict those behaviors. The principle of aggregation is the idea that you can increase the relationship between attitudes and behaviors by aggregating across multiple behaviors, and aggregating across multiple time points, and aggregating across multiple specific behavior types. So yeah, sure. So you aggregate, to increase the relationship between your attitude measure and your behavior, if you aggregate your behavioral measures, you aggregate over time, so you look at different time points, but you also aggregate over different kinds of specific behaviors, so you look at not just one single behavior, but lots of different types of related behaviors. And so